The bay looked calm from a distance, a sheet of gray water boxed in by jagged Alaskan cliffs dusted with late-season snow. The tourist boat had entered the inlet just before dusk, guided by satellite charts and a captain who had navigated glacier country for 15 years. 8 passengers stood on deck wrapped in layered jackets, phones raised to capture the floating ice that drifted like broken glass across the surface. It was supposed to be a controlled overnight anchorage. Drop lines, rest, continue south at first light. But weather in coastal Alaska doesn't negotiate. By midnight, shifting wind pushed heavier pack ice into the narrow mouth of the bay, sealing the entrance behind them. The engine could push through light flows, not a tightening wall of pressure-frozen slabs grinding together. Captain Roy cut power and waited for tide shift that never came. By morning, the channel was locked in white compression. The radio signal was weak but functional. Coast Guard response would take hours, maybe longer if conditions worsened. They rationed fuel. They conserved battery. It would be uncomfortable, not dangerous. At least that's what Roy told them. The first sign of something else came from shore. The rocky coastline looked empty at first glance, just dark stone and scattered driftwood along a thin strip between water and forest. Then one of the passengers, Mira, noticed movement near a cluster of overturned crab pots left abandoned from a previous season. A massive shape moved through them slowly, nose down, pushing debris aside. Brown fur thick and matted from coastal damp. Shoulder hump high and muscular. A full-grown Alaskan brown bear. Large, healthy, too close to shore for coincidence. Roy lowered binoculars slowly. "He's used to camps," he muttered. The bear did not move like a wild forager avoiding human scent. He moved like an animal familiar with garbage, fish guts, abandoned bait stations. The shoreline of that bay had hosted seasonal fishing camps for years. Food conditioning changes boundaries. Hunger reshapes distance tolerance. The bear lifted his head toward the anchored boat and held still for several seconds. Wind carried scent across ice and water. The tourists watched in uneasy fascination as he began walking along the narrow shoreline parallel to their position. Not charging, not retreating, pacing. The first night was quiet. The bear remained on shore, occasionally disappearing into tree line before re-emerging. The second night brought impact. Around 2 a.m, a heavy thud struck the hull from below the waterline. Not ice pressure, not current, a deliberate bump against metal. Roy jolted awake and stepped into the cabin, scanning with spotlight. Nothing surfaced near the boat. The shoreline looked empty in the beam. Then a scraping sound echoed faintly across ice. Claws against aluminum. The bear had crossed partially frozen shallows and reached a smaller dinghy tethered at the stern. The inflatable raft jerked violently as the animal tore at it, jaws ripping through rubber with brutal efficiency. The sound of fabric shredding in cold air carried clean and sharp. Passengers gathered in panic near the windows. Roy blasted the horn. The bear flinched once but did not flee immediately. It dragged the ruined dinghy partially onto the ice edge and ripped through its interior, searching for scent of stored food. When it found none, it turned its massive head back toward the anchored boat. The distance between hull and shoreline was no longer a comfort. Ice flows had shifted overnight, forming a rough bridge in places between shore and anchored vessel. Not stable for humans. Stable enough for a bear, with 400 pounds of muscle and thick winter fat. Roy cut deck lights to conserve battery. Darkness swallowed the bay except for pale moonlight reflecting off ice. The bear remained visible as a dark mass moving between floes, testing footing. He stepped onto a larger slab and paused, nose lifting again toward the boat. Brown bears in true wilderness avoid metal and engine noise. This one did not retreat at the smell of diesel or human sweat. He had learned that camps mean calories, that boats mean stored fish, that fear from humans means hesitation. Ice groaned softly under his weight as he advanced one floe closer to open water near the stern. He did not attempt to swim yet. He did not need to rush. The bay was sealed. The tourists were isolated. And a bear that has fed at camps before understands something simple. Boats cannot outrun ice. And hunger in cold climates does not argue with opportunity. By morning, the dinghy was gone, shredded down to tangled rubber and rope, frozen into the shoreline ice. The bear had not left. Fresh tracks pressed deep into the thin snow crust along the rocks proved he had circled the bay at least twice before dawn. Roy counted the spacing of the prints through binoculars. Long stride, heavy weight, no limp, no visible injury. This was not a desperate, starving animal on its last edge. This was a dominant coastal brown bear, accustomed to scavenging high-calorie human waste and unwilling to surrender a trapped food source. The ice between shore and boat had thickened overnight, where floes had compacted under wind pressure. It was not a solid sheet, but it was denser, patches of white compression connecting like stepping stones. The bear returned mid-afternoon, walking straight out onto the frozen shallows without hesitation. He tested each slab once with his forepaw, then shifted weight smoothly. His balance was controlled, confident. He had done this before. The passengers watched from behind cabin glass as he advanced halfway across the bay, before stopping on a larger floe and sitting back on his haunches, eyes fixed on the hull. Waiting. Hunger in cold water is patient. Roy checked fuel reserves again and tried the engine briefly, churning slush near the bow in an attempt to break channel ice. The prop ground against packed floes with an ugly metallic vibration before he cut it off. Burning fuel without progress would only shorten their window. The Coast Guard radioed back with an updated ETA pushed into late evening due to shifting ice fields farther south. "Remain aboard," the dispatcher said. "Avoid shore. Avoid shore." The instruction felt hollow with a 400-pound predator closing the gap. As twilight settled, the temperature dropped sharply. Ice thickens fastest in darkness. Around 10, the first heavy impact struck the stern again. Not a random bump. A shove. The entire boat lurched forward slightly against anchor line. A second shove followed seconds later. Roy grabbed the spotlight and swept the stern. The bear stood knee-deep in near-shore water, pushing his shoulder against the hull. He was not trying to climb yet. He was testing stability, testing reaction. Roy blasted the horn again and fired a flare into the air. The bright arc hissed and burst above the water, showering sparks down onto ice. The bear recoiled half a step, shook his head once, then returned to the hull. Conditioning reduces fear thresholds. Bears that have eaten from camps learn that noise often precedes food being abandoned. A third shove hit harder. The anchor line creaked under strain. One of the passengers screamed as the stern tilted slightly. Roy shouted for everyone to move weight forward toward the bow to counterbalance. They shifted in panic, boots slipping on cold metal deck. The bear rose partially upright then, forepaws scraping along the stern railing, claws screeching against aluminum. The sound cut through the bay like tearing steel. He could not reach fully yet. The deck height was still too high above the waterline, but ice floes continued compacting beneath him. With each shove, he was packing the ice tighter against the hull. Directly. He backed off this time with a directly. He backed off this time with a low, guttural roar that echoed off frozen cliffs. But even as he retreated 3 or 4 steps, he did not flee to shore. He circled instead, scanning the boat from another angle. Midnight passed slowly. The passengers huddled in the central cabin, whispering in fractured sentences. The temperature dropped further. Frost crept along interior windows. Outside, the bear reappeared along the starboard side, where ice had bridged closer to midship. He stepped up onto a slab, now only inches below deck level. He extended one massive paw upward and hooked claws briefly over the edge before losing leverage. The deck light flicked on automatically as Roy attempted to conserve battery cycles. In that harsh white glare, the bear's face was fully visible. Scarred muzzle, thick neck fur crusted with ice, eyes steady and unblinking. He was not enraged. He was calculating calories. The shove came again, this time accompanied by a grinding crunch beneath the hull as ice compacted tighter under pressure. The boat no longer floated freely. It was being wedged. And a bear accustomed to camps understands something else as well. Boats often carry fish in storage holds. Hunger in sub-zero air does not retreat easily. It presses. And in a bay sealed by ice, pressing becomes a strategy. By 3 a.m, the bay no longer looked like water. It looked like fractured white stone pressed tight against the hull from every side. The boat had lost its gentle sway. It sat trapped in a cradle of compacted floes that creaked and groaned under shifting pressure. Roy could feel it through the deck plates, the subtle lift and settle as ice tightened against steel. The bear understood it too. He returned from the dark shoreline just before dawn, moving slower now, conserving strength. Frost clung to his fur, breath rolling from his nostrils in thick vapor clouds. He did not shove immediately this time. He walked the perimeter of the trapped hull, testing the ice he himself had helped compress. Each slab barely shifted under his weight. The platform was forming. Inside the cabin, passengers whispered in short, shallow breaths. Roy handed out emergency flares and instructed 2 of the strongest men to hold position near the stern with him. "If he gets a paw up," Roy said quietly, "we burn him back." The words felt thin in the cold air. The first attempt came without warning. The bear surged upward from a dense floe pressed against the stern corner, hind legs digging into packed ice for leverage. One massive forepaw hooked fully over the railing this time, claws biting into metal grip tape. The boat tilted sharply toward that side as weight shifted. Roy fired a flare downward, the bright red projectile striking the bear's shoulder and ricocheting into ice. The hiss of burning magnesium lit the bay in violent color. The bear roared, not in fear, but in anger, and dropped back onto the ice. He shook his head once and immediately circled to the port side instead. Conditioning had removed hesitation. Pain did not equal retreat. It equaled recalculation. The ice under midship cracked loudly as he tested a new slab, but it held. He rose again, both forepaws slamming onto the side rail simultaneously. The impact vibrated through the entire structure. A passenger screamed as the stern dipped lower. cold water sloshing against deck plating beneath. One of the men jammed a flare directly toward the bear's face at arm's length. The flare burst inches from his muzzle, sparks scattering across fur. The bear recoiled again, but this time he did not retreat more than 2 steps. He swiped once across the railing, claws slicing through a coiled rope and sending it snapping back across deck. Roy grabbed a metal boathook and drove it downward toward the bear's snout, striking bone hard enough to ring through his arms. The bear snapped at the hook instantly, jaws clamping down and bending the steel shaft like wire before releasing. Ice shifted under his hind legs but did not collapse. The platform was nearly stable enough for a full climb. Dawn's first gray light began bleeding across the cliffs, illuminating the entire frozen basin. The bear backed up several paces now, lowering his head and pacing along the ice. He was building momentum. Roy felt it before it happened. The shift from testing to committing. The bear lunged forward with full speed, hindquarters driving powerfully against the packed flow. He hit the hull higher than before, both forepaws clearing the railing entirely as his chest rose above deck level. For one breathless second, half his body hung over the stern, claws scraping metal as weight threatened to tip the boat fully onto its side. Roy discharged the fire extinguisher directly into his open mouth, while the other man rammed a burning flare against the inside of his foreleg. The combined shock finally broke the climb. The bear dropped back hard onto the ice, which fractured loudly under the sudden shift. A crack shot through the floe supporting him, widening fast. He scrambled sideways just as the slab split, plunging one hind leg briefly into freezing water before he hauled himself onto a thicker section. That fracture changed geometry. The packed ice at the stern loosened slightly as water pushed up between newly separated slabs. Roy seized the moment and restarted the engine despite grinding risk. The prop churned violently, chewing at fractured ice with metallic shrieks. Water frothed and surged, widening the crack beneath the stern. The bear stood 10 feet away now, chest heaving, watching the churn. He did not rush blindly this time. He stepped back toward more stable ice near shore. The engine's vibration, combined with shifting flows, began to reintroduce instability to his platform. For the first time since nightfall, the boat moved independently of ice pressure. Slowly at first, inches. Then more as Roy angled the prop into widening water seam. The bear paced along the ice edge parallel to the hull, no longer attempting immediate climb, but refusing to give ground fully. In his world, boats meant food, but unstable footing meant risk. As the widening channel separated hull from shore by several more feet, he stopped at the edge of the broken floe and stared across at them. Breath steaming, eyes steady. Not defeated, not enraged, assessing new probability. The Coast Guard engine hum finally echoed faintly beyond the ice wall at the bay entrance. Relief did not come as cheers. It came as quiet understanding. The bear turned slowly and walked back toward the tree line without haste. Hunger had driven him onto the ice. Conditioning had brought him to the rail, but unstable footing had redrawn the line. In Alaska, survival belongs to whatever reads conditions faster. And that morning, shifting ice, not fear, had finally changed the rules. The Coast Guard cutter broke through the outer ice field just after full daylight, its reinforced hull grinding steadily through fractured slabs that Roy's smaller prop had only been able to crack. The sound of heavy steel against ice carried across the bay, like distant thunder. By the time the larger vessel reached visual range, the tourist boat had freed itself from the tightest compression, but still sat boxed in by floating sheets that shifted unpredictably. Roy cut his engine and let the cutter do the work, riding the widening channel it forced open. On shore, the bear stood at the tree line, watching the approach without agitation. He did not flee at the noise. He did not charge the breaking hull. He observed. The cutter maneuvered alongside carefully, crew members tossing secured lines across the short distance. Passengers transferred one by one over metal rails, boots clanging on frozen deck, breath fogging in short bursts of relief and exhaustion. No one looked back at the stern until they were safely aboard the cutter. Only then did a few turn and see the bear again, standing at the edge of ice where it had compacted overnight. He was not pacing now. He was still. Roy remained the last to step across. Before leaving, he glanced once more at the scraped metal along the stern rail where claws had hooked and bent aluminum inward. The marks were deep, deliberate, evidence not of madness, but of learning. When the cutter powered forward, widening the channel entirely and freeing the smaller boat to trail behind, ice groaned and separated in long, white seams. The bear walked along the shoreline parallel to them for nearly 100 yards before stopping. He did not attempt to follow into deeper water. He did not test the reinforced hull of the cutter. He had calculated threshold again. The bay opened gradually behind them as the ice field thinned toward the inlet mouth. Coast Guard personnel debriefed Roy in clipped, professional tones. Reports would note an aggressive, human-conditioned brown bear exhibiting repeated approach behavior toward a trapped vessel. Wildlife authorities would likely monitor the shoreline camps come spring, perhaps relocate refuse sites, perhaps track the animal. But relocation in Alaska is rarely simple. Bears that learn where food once existed do not unlearn it quickly. By afternoon, the trapped tourist boat was escorted clear of the inlet entirely. From open water, the bay looked smaller than it had from inside its frozen walls. The passengers spoke in hushed fragments about the weight of those paws on metal, about the sound of claws scraping rail in the dark. Roy stood at the stern of the cutter for a moment longer than necessary, watching the shrinking strip of shoreline. The bear had already disappeared into trees. Snow would fall again. Ice would break and reform with the tides, seasonal fishing camps would reopen in warmer months, and somewhere along that rocky edge a large brown bear would continue to patrol, nose low, testing scent carried by wind across cold water. He had not attacked out of rage. He had not been driven purely by starvation. He had acted within a pattern reinforced over seasons. Boats equal food, camps equal calories, noise equals opportunity. Ice had trapped the tourists. Conditioning had brought the bear onto frozen slabs. The clash between them was not chaos. It was convergence. As the cutter cleared into open channel and the bay vanished behind rock and fog, the water smoothed into a flat gray expanse once more. But Roy knew something that glossy brochures never mention about glacier inlets and frozen coves. In cold climates, hunger does not disappear with winter. It sharpens. And when ice seals escape roots, the line between observer and prey grows thin enough to test with a single claw.